armed conflict. 1995, François Mitterrand withdraws from power, and now he is free. Louis Joinet is free to work for the UN system. He has visited about 160 prisons across the world. And I discovered how much a visit of somebody sitting in jail to help him to resist oppression, especially when you're in prison, so how important these visits were. A documentary from the Swiss TV pays a tribute to his work in the Human Rights Council. For more than 25 years, this man goes and visits these places and denounces, speaks up against the breach of the human rights. It's an outcry against barbarism. UN, in the UN you have the states, and in many states I'd say that the human rights are not their cup of tea. And on one hand you have theory, barbarism, and on the other hand you have your human rights. I have chosen my side.
Mesdames et messieurs, Louis Joinet. Louis Joinet, donc l'un des invités de marque de ce 15e anniversaire. On est extrêmement touchés par votre venue, par votre présence. On l'a vu, un juriste exceptionnel, un visionnaire. Vous avez consacré toute votre vie, corps et âme, à la défense des droits humains et à la défense aussi des libertés, de toutes les libertés. Je crois qu'aussi vous nous avez aidé à comprendre une notion absolument capitale. C'est que le droit doit évoluer. Ce n'est pas une notion rigide. C'est une notion qui doit s'adapter aussi à l'évolution de la société, qui doit progresser. Cette notion du progrès, on a parfois tendance à l'oublier. En 1968, je crois que c'est dans cette optique aussi que vous avez fondé le Syndicat de la Magistrature, ce qui a aussi libéré la parole des magistrats. Toute votre vie, vous vous êtes engagé pour la défense de tous les droits. On l'a vu aussi dans le film, le droit des peuples autochtones en Nouvelle-Zélande, le droit des agriculteurs au Larzac, le droit des victimes de l'impunité aussi, les droits des victimes de toute la barbarie. Vous êtes enfin une figure absolument tutélaire du droit international. Vous êtes l'un des artisans de la Convention internationale contre les disparitions forcées.
You are one of the authors of the International Convention against forced disappearance, and you have also committed yourself against impunity. So with Martin Ancel, so this evening as yesterday, show us that around the festival you have circles of people, of friends, of people understanding and defending the same cause, and so we meet. And Martin Hanstead, to whom we dedicated our opening ceremony yesterday, and we gave the prize Martin Hanstead to Teddy Mazina, is a reporter of Burundi. And of course we could see Stéphane Essel, who was a great friend of our festival and who came here several times. Louis Joinet, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. Could I have a chair, please, in order to put my documents? Okay. So I can start. Good evening. Good evening again, because last time it was 5 years ago. I had the great honor to being invited. The topic which I want to deal with is very complicated and too actual. It's a state of the human rights in a world which has become unforeseeable, and we could just see it in this film, unfortunately. So to make a picture of what is at stake within 15 minutes is quite a challenge. So I'll take only 4 aspects which seem to me very important to illustrate this topic. I would say there are things which I draw from my experience on the field. First thing which is at stake, I would say the difficulty, and we are in Geneva, to apply the Geneva Convention on the humanitarian right in conflicts in the present context, and also to bring to an end the peace negotiations which are being done here and there. So I'll start with the more complicated aspect. In front of such an unforeseeable world, the Geneva Convention find themselves in a kind of a crisis. We are not in front of 2 camps, 2 sides. There is no front line. The jihadist violence can emerge everywhere, unexpectedly, and on all continents. From the moment where certain belligerents have considered the victory is their own death in order to become a martyr by suicide or because they are killed of and a martyr has to kill. It has to die with the weapons in hand. These situations are very difficult to understand from the legal point of view by the Geneva Convention, who try to rule the humanitarian law during a conflict. When I was a young man, to formate the minds, one would say to die for the fatherland is the most beautiful thing. So let's take this issue from another end. From the moment when the violations of the human rights are like, I take the extent of mass crimes in order to kill as many people as much in an undifferentiated way, because I want to highlight that, because they kill people even who think like them, because the most numerous victims of Daesh are Muslims. From this point of view, the Twin Towers hit by 2 suicide planes was a turning point. From that day, nothing was like before in the defense strategies of human rights or in the implementation of humanitarian law. Then, coming after that, you had a whole series of attacks like those, for instance, in Paris, in my neighborhood, in Bataclan, who was not a military target, it was only a theater, or those attacks who killed shoppers because they were unbelievers, because they would just share a glass together, or Nice with his truck hitting a huge peaceful cloud. The only common point was that these attacks have been done in an unexpected way to subject the public opinion to fear. The solution, I wouldn't dare to try to find one. The only things which can be observed is the priority given to the prevention by the intelligence services. And here the NGOs have to be more vigilant, because the states are tempted in such situation to take measures which will kill freedom, like emergency state, which is always renewed, or, for instance, to stop judges from doing their work. The difficulty to bring to a term the peace negotiation in the present context, where anti-terrorism is everywhere. Let's take the example of the conflict in the Basque Country. You have on one side Spain and France, on the other side ETA, who only 3 months ago, 5 years ago, would lead an independence war through attacks. I know this conflict rurally because I was member of the COPIL, the steering committee of the peace process. Such a process supposes at first that one abandons certain reflexes, which implies quite a cultural reconversion of the minds from the activists who are for the guerrillas, then from the state. A reconversion when an activist was day for day underground with the tensions, with the suspicion, with no married life. The return to light implies a reconversion also in the professional area, and it's not easy, especially in the beginnings. Also, it's also a cultural reconversion when during a long time was convinced that he could, through arms, obtain what he wanted. And with all the treasons of their comrades who died in the conflict, and all that could be felt, all these concessions in the negotiation can be felt by the militant activists like a treason towards their dead comrades in the conflicts. This reflex, if it's not taken seriously, would lead to reactions of radicalization on the topic. I told you the state has betrayed us with your complicity. Then evolution is not reconversion of the role of the judges dealing with anti-terrorism and those who are in charge of implementing the condemnations. For instance, for the Basque question, most of the prisoners are all condemned to a sentence which is definitive. Since the peace process should lead to the progressive freeing of all the prisoners, so the sentences are changed, they are freed on parole, with electronic surveillance, and this is also it's all the role of the judges. And they have no special vocational training for such situation in the context of a peace agreement. Then you have also the transitional justice, which is a new kind of justice. And there are lots of disagreements about it. So, from my point of view, and from what I've experienced on the field, it is a very flexible approach.
On a tendance à considérer à tort que la justice traditionnelle est un en soi,
alors that the justice is something which exists, but it's only one specific aspect at a specific moment of the history of a country, of a larger process which is called political transition. Such a process doesn't concern only the legal, the judiciary system, but also the executive system.
Qui applique toujours les lois liberticides. L'exécutif, parce que le gouvernement est en
executive because there's no government, and the legislative system, which must be also a transition legislative power. Each of these processes has its own specificity. If we come from war to peace through negotiation, when the ballots take the place of the arms, like in Colombia, or the transition from an authoritarian regime to a rule of law through the negotiation, through a national dialogue, through a platform, or like the transition in Chile. These are some examples taken from the present situation I was confronted to.
Prenons le cas de mon mandat en Haïti.
For instance,
Lorsque
in Haiti, when I arrived,
tant le pouvoir exécutif
as well as the executive power, so the Prime Minister, as the legislative power, the Parliament,
sont absents. Ils sont en déshérence.
Absent.
Suite à une session de créativité juridique intense entre l'ONU,
discussion between ONU and the rest of the political class, and because there was a very dynamic civil society, we came to the traditional solution, which is quite original, as you can see.
Dans un premier temps,
in a first step,
we
set up a troika composed by a high-level senior person of UN, the president, who should look two persons of opposed political parties. The troika was charged with the recruitment of a council of 7 wise men. This council received as a mandate to find a certain number of people. So another high-level officer of the UN who was retired. So, waiting for this legislative election, and in transition, they would rule by decrees, and each decree would precise that it was a provisionary measure and not against the Constitution, but just not within the Constitution. As the country starts to recover between tempests, hurricanes, and this huge, terrible earthquake where a lot of my co-workers lost their life, everything was crumbled politically.
So a third objective, to try and actually put an end to the tragedy of mass rapes. For me, this was one of the most difficult situations. These practices very often have been for a very long time taboo, and it's only recently that the international community has actually become aware of the extent of the tragedy. According to the United Nations statistics, we consider that there's about 500,000 cases of rape committed in the region of the Great Lakes over the last 15 years. 250,000 or more committed during the genocide in Rwanda, and between 20,000 and 50,000 during the Bosnian conflict. And 1/3 of the people convicted by the International Criminal Tribunal, Yugoslavia, were actually found guilty for crimes involving sexual violence. Sometimes, as was seen in Liberia, rape as a war weapon was actually used by belligerents on both sides. So too often, rape is actually considered as a bonus offered to the victor. And all along the 30 years at the United Nations, I noticed that in some conflicts, especially in Bosnia-Herzegovina, this horrible practice took the shape of mass rape with multiple objectives, such as to apply an enslavement strategy of women. And rape is a sort of a double sentence to actually set up a climate of generalized terror, to provoke, to humiliate men, and actually demographically Serbize the Bosniak community through rape and interposed impregnation. And one needs to know that the repression of these crimes is up against very difficult overcomable difficulties, such as actually doing investigation in situ, and also the silence of the victims, because they're afraid of vengeance and they don't want to be stigmatized, and they are scared of being marginalized by their environment, especially when there's an obligation of being a virgin before marriage. But I noticed that nevertheless there are some good reasons to hope, since on the one hand the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court has actually given a priority to the sexist violence, and also civil society is actually mobilizing it, and especially the International Committee of the Red Cross, and it's organizing specific programs, and some NGOs such as the Observatory on Sexual Violences during the armed conflict that was created in 2005, and also the Yugoslavian criminal tribunal has anticipated this evolution through its very audacious case law by giving a priority to the charging authors of sexual crimes related to the conflict. That is why they've opened investigation on such violence as soon as it was set up, and also, as was the case with the tribunal on Rwanda, there was the qualification of these crimes against as crimes against humanity. More than 1/3 of the convictions that were decided were done so for sexual crimes, and the evidence is very difficult to find due to the hesitations of the victims to actually bring testimonials, because they are afraid of vengeance and because of the psychosomatic sequela. This was also possible because of the tribunal, despite its lackings and the criticism that we've done, has been able to actually forge a progressive case law, and also it was able to interpret in a constructive manner all the possibilities offered by its actually procedural regulation. And I've also noticed when I was actually asked to testify before the International Criminal Tribunal of Yugoslavia in the Florence Hartmann case, that this is actually a privileged venue to allow the surviving victims to actually overcome their hesitations and to actually give evidence about their suffering. And this has contributed to actually break down the silence and the tradition of impunity that too often surrounds the sexual crimes. Two series of measures have contributed to this breaking down of silence. One of them have to do with debates such as the people being incited to avoid doing interrogations of the witnesses in a traumatizing way, because in this types of case, the only witnesses are almost always the victims, and now they can actually bring testimonials under actually another name, and they also have their voice, which is actually transformed, and you can't see their faces, and it's in chambers. The second series of measures actually concern the assistance that's provided to the victims through the creation of a division that helps the victims and to the witnesses before, during, and after the deposition, and it's done remarkable work. I've been able to see this for myself. The fourth objective is to reinforce the effectiveness and efficacy of the Convention Against Enforced Disappearance. A few days ago, we were actually celebrating the 10th anniversry of the Convention Against Enforced Disappearances. So I'd like to actually insist on the importance of the provisions of this convention, and of course the family of those who've disappeared, who keep actually having in mind the haunting question: what happened? Where are they? The objective of the convention has a priority to fight against forgetting those who've disappeared, and this is being organized by the states wanting to actually turn the page before actually having read it. This is a priority because for families, fighting against disappearances is a fighting against the time that goes by, and that so there's no statute of limitations. But what can you do when the author identified has died, and his death actually puts an end to the charges, and of course an end to the investigations carried out to actually find the body of the person who appeared identified, and to return to his family to allow it to actually organize funerals. I got the answer to that question during one of my missions in former Yugoslavia, when with the famous anthropologist Clyde Snow, we were trying to actually find the
Nous sommes complémentaires.
graves. And he
Avec
said, you
votre
see,
droit
Joinet,
et
we
votre
are actually complimenting
imprescriptibilité,
you with your
vous
law.
pouvez certes
You can, of
suspendre le
course,
temps,
actually stop time, but
mais
not
pas au-delà de la mort de l'auteur.
further than
Nous,
the death of the
avec
author.
l'anthropologie
We,
légale,
with
nous pouvons
actually
remonter dans
legal
le temps
anthropology, we can
pour
actually go
retrouver la
back in
trace
time
des
to
disparus,
find the trace of
les
those who disappeared, to
identifier par
identify them
ADN
through their
interposé, et
interposed
ceci de
DNA,
génération
and this from one generation to the
tant que
next,
le cas n'est pas
so
élucidé.
long as we haven't found the
Et je dois
answers.
dire,
And I must say, and I will now conclude, that one of the most moving moments of my life at the United Nations was when, President Kessejian
consacra l'adoption de la Convention.
actually
Moi-même,
ratified the adoption of the convention, and again, being extremely moved when I went home, I wrote these few lines,
la partager avec vous.
and I'd like to share them with you,
La présence
and in the invisible presence of those who've disappeared.
Étais-je de Cordoba?
Was I from Cordoba, from Dili or Jakarta, Erevan or Bogota?
Je m'appelle Norma.
And my name is Norma. I am, I'm no longer, I don't know anymore. Disappeared, kidnapped, and victim of an almost perfect crime of less humanity. So I disappeared in the sky from flight to death that's remained mysterious, invisible amongst all of you, but very much by your sides. Thank you for not forgetting me.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Joinet.
Thank you very much, Mr. Joinet.
Donc on va passer à la suite de la soirée.
Continuing our evening.
Gentlemen, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Let me introduce myself quickly. My name is Kasper Selg. I used to be an editor for Swiss Broadcasting Corporation for the German-speaking network. I used to do international affairs for some 35 years, and I was asked to moderate this discussion tonight. The two elements that we've seen so far, the moving movie, I guess there's a combination there, and the speech from Mr. Joinet, these are very tough acts to follow, but most of all, these are two elements that bring up a lot of questions, and we'd like to discuss these in a slightly shorter format than we had previously anticipated, because we're already at 10:15. But we'll have ample time to ask ourselves a couple of questions along the lines that Philippe Motta has laid out at the beginning of this evening. And we'll do that with two very distinguished gentlemen. Andrew Clapham is a professor for international public law at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies here in Geneva. Would he please come up to the stage? He was also the director of the Geneva Academy of International and Humanitarian Law and Human Rights. And he was active in Iraq. And I mention this because of what we have seen, not for all too long, but he was involved in humanitarian rights affairs in Iraq. And the other gentleman I'm asking to come up stage here is Stephen Hopgood, a professor for international relations at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. He is also a co-director of the Center of Conflict, Rights and Justice at the same university, he too with a whole host of other activities. Where to start after all we've seen tonight? I'll ask you first, Andrew, a personal question. You have been involved in humanitarian questions in Iraq. That was at the beginning of the 2000s, what, 2003, if I'm correct. What's your feeling when you look at how things evolved 10, 15 years later?
I'll hold it. Okay. Good evening. Well, it's obviously a tragedy. I mean, it's tragic and it's catastrophic for the people who are there.
On a personal level, are you discouraged, having done all you've done and now seeing how things evolve?
Well, I wouldn't say I've done so much. I think there's a lot for all of us to do. One could be very easily discouraged. One could say the human rights violations are so horrific and so ongoing that what's the point of talking about human rights? Louis Joinet's points with regards to transitional justice or with regards to accountability seem obviously pertinent for the Basque situation or for Haiti and somehow irrelevant here. But I don't think we should throw in the towel and just forget about it and say Iraq is just too difficult, Syria is too difficult. At some stage we have to continue now to work to try to build some sort of society, and I do genuinely believe it could be a society built on human rights. I don't think human rights has nothing to offer. And in the same sense, I don't think we should despair that the Geneva Conventions are bouleversées every day and therefore are sort of somehow no longer relevant.
They're still relevant, but the main question we have here, and that's what the discussion is all about, the state of human rights in a changing and unpredictable world. You say we don't have to despair, we can still work with these elements or with these instruments, but are human rights not in recess? Are they not in danger?
I mean, the point about human rights is that they are a claim, they are a suggestion that something has gone wrong. Now, it's true that the people in the film did not use the language of human rights. They didn't really express their claims as human rights claims. But in fact, a lot of the violations that you see, in particularly, if you like, we can talk about the war crimes that you see, at some point, there should be some accountability. And when Louis Joinet talks about imprescriptibilité, it means that those are crimes that continue. There's no time limit on them. Now, of course, we don't see any chance of catching any of the protagonists there. But we also heard at the very beginning of the soiree this evening about Hissène Habré. And probably many people in Chad thought that he would never be brought to justice. And I may be sounding rather over-optimistic here and Pollyannish, but I think we have to hold the line. I think it's worth continuing to say that these are violations of international law, they're violations of Iraqi law, and if you want to build a society, we have to start to turn towards some ideas like human rights and start to think about prosecutions. Why should we only prosecute people in Colombia or in Syria? Why not also from Iraq?
Let me say, before I come to you, that of course we're going to discuss this issue in how far are human rights in danger. We're going to discuss the reasons why, what has happened, when has it happened, and thirdly, what has to be done, what could be done. And of course, you will be involved. We'll discuss these questions here on stage first, but we'll include your ideas, your questions, of course, too, in not all too long a time. This was not a very pessimistic view of the state of human rights in this world. Yours is a little bit different. If I look at the title of your book, it basically talks about the end times of human rights. Was that just a very interesting title that sells the book very well, or is this really your conviction?
No. You want to do this? Okay. It's well, when you say it's my conviction, it sounds as if it's something I want to happen, and that's absolutely not the case. But it is my conviction as a political scientist that the era in which many, if not most major international progressive developments went through the lens of human rights is coming to an end. I mean, I don't in some ways agree with you that Andrew was being, he was finding some optimism, but as a human rights advocate, it's quite difficult to find that optimism today. And I think the signs have been there for a while that things are running out of steam for 2 or 3 reasons. First of all, the rise of a much more multipolar world and the relative decline of the West. So since 9/11, the rise of China, the rise of Russia, beginning to block various kinds of human rights developments. Secondly, and this is something I was very critical about in the book, a focus of the international human rights movement on what for me was an overreach. The International Criminal Court, responsibility to protect. Okay, I think these things are never going to really deliver anything that looks like justice or serious kinds of intervention.
May I quickly interrupt? Excuse me, but before we come to these various points, and we'll come to them, I just want to know, is the development of human rights in danger, or is it just the application? Is it the, are they not accepted anymore, or are they not followed anymore? Those are 2 different levels, it seems to me.
Well, the sort of the general commitment to the idea of rights and people, the name recognition of human rights is probably wider now than it's ever been, and it's a total revolution compared with the 1970s. But when you actually look at the degree to which these rights constrain powerful governments, are actually implemented, even in terms of things like women's rights, LGBT rights, you see in many parts of the world shallow, if not non-existent implementation of these rights. They're effective where they embed themselves in social coalitions of people who actually support them. And the big shock for us is that the areas where these rights were really very effectively accepted now look like they might be turning against those rights too. And that's a story in the United States, particularly in the Republican Party, going back much longer than Donald Trump, an aversion to this human rights rhetoric.
So the area in which they are accepted diminishes more and more, and so the actual effectivity of human rights is diminishing.
I think you wanted to have a debate. I'm not going to disappoint you, Mr. Moderator. Stephen Hopgood says, that...
I can ask the question differently. Do you agree with him?
I disagree, to be very clear. So I think he's suggesting that the human rights movement has overreached. And I would suggest that the human rights movement hasn't gone far enough. So let's put aside the International Criminal Court for a moment. We can come back to that. But if you think about the film, there were 2 protagonists in the film that we didn't really see. First of all, you never saw the coalition forces. I mean, obviously, all of this was because of the 2003 war and the invasion by the British and the Americans and others. But we don't see them in the film. And I think, if you think, well, some people here won't maybe remember so much 2003, but the human rights movement in 2003 were obviously, all the people that I met were totally against the idea of this war. But somehow one got into discussions about legality and technical issues about human rights violations rather than saying it's a stupid war. It's going to be a bad idea and you're going to have sectarian violence and you're going to have all that we saw in the film. To say that people were not predicting this would be foolish. I mean, that was quite seen. So I think somehow the human rights movement has to be able to engage with big military countries that want to go to war. And somehow that has always been, no, that's not what we do. We focus on human rights. We don't focus on, even give it the Latin tag, jus ad bellum, the people who want to go to war. That's not what we do. I think we have to change that. I mean, not suggesting the human rights movement has to become a peace movement, but there are rights to life involved here. Sorry, the second protagonist that we don't see are ISIS. And I would suggest that the human rights movement has to start to engage with some of the armed groups that are committing the atrocities that you see in the film. And again, historically, the human rights movement has said, a little as Stephen is suggesting, look, we've got enough on our plates, let's focus on what we can do and not overreach and start to engage with armed groups. Now, I know there are people in the audience here, Elizabeth de Cray-Warner was here, who runs an organization that engages with armed groups, and that's a radical step. But I think if you want to start to address some of the problems that we have in today's world, one's going to have to start to do that. So overreach, no, I think we have to go further.
Do you agree?
Obviously not. And one of the dangers of overreach is that you you promise more and achieve less, and this leads to a degree of cynicism and skepticism about what human rights can actually realize. I want to pick up on one point Andrew made there, which I think is important, which is he mentioned that he's not advocating that the human rights movement really become a peace movement. And I think there's an absolutely critical issue here. For me, human rights emerges in the 1970s when the organized left really falls apart. And what you get is a whole variety of identity rights, and particularly within the West, no really organized leftist parties for 30, 40 years. Now, these parties are beginning to try to reform themselves against that sort of right-wing populism. And the question of how human rights fits into a broader progressive left is when human rights tries to hold itself often apart from that left, more mass social movement or political movement, is a critical question for the years that are coming. Can human rights play well with serious leftist parties? Is it on the left side of the spectrum, or can it maintain that sort of neutrality between left and right?
Now, we're in a whole host of different questions now. One is still, why did we get to the point where we are? And the other one is, what can be done? And here we have the problem of one strictly legal view of the things, and obviously we're talking about political elements that should come alongside. Let me first go back quickly to the question, what is the problem? Where did the problem arise? We heard one theory, which was 9/11 was the turning point. Monsieur Joinet, I think, said that. You were talking about the Iraq War. You are arguing in your book that this is a development that started earlier.
Well,
why did it start and when?
The modern human rights movement as a sort of global political force only really begins to get going in the 1970s, regardless of the declaration being decades before that. But it really, for me, only has a high point for about 15 years, from the end of the Cold War to sort of 2003, when Iraq's for me, signals the beginning of a kind of American imperial overreach, cynicism that the Chinese, the Russians, and many others can begin to build on. And by the time we get to Libya and the condemnation of R2P in Libya, I think this global human rights movement has effectively run out of steam.
It has run out of steam, but your theory is that the high time of human rights was in the unipolar world, when the Soviet Union, when the East Bloc collapsed. Is that your view too, or do you think...
No, it's not. You'll be pleased to hear. I think there has been a lot of attention recently by historians, and obviously in Stephen's book, on this sort of magic moment in the 70s when Amnesty International won the Nobel Peace Prize and Jimmy Carter was making speeches about human rights. That sort of human rights as politics, or human rights as foreign affairs, or human rights in the media. But I mean, from my own experience, human rights as a movement and human rights organizations are alone in sort of alive and well, I should say, in places like Mexico. Tunisia had for some time a strong human rights movement, even Iraq at some point, and it will come back again. So I think the idea that we should sort of be obsessed by what was happening in the human rights with, I'm going to steal Stephen's line now, with a capital H, capital R, which you can read about in his book. That's true, that is one type of human rights, but there's human rights on the ground, which I would suggest, Iraq and Syria notwithstanding, the human rights movement and human rights NGOs are quite healthy, despite the fact that there may be a crisis from time to time in the Human Rights Council.
If we look at the situations today, the difficulties, one obviously is, and it was mentioned too, that we don't have regular warfare anymore, which was ruled, quote unquote, by humanitarian law. Today we have warfare as it was described in the film. Another one is overreach, and overreach we could interpret also as an overreach in terms of what human rights activists wanted. Overreach in the sense that during the high time of the human rights movement, rules were designed that just went further than certain societies could accept. Is that a type of a problem too?
I think the point of human rights is always to go a bit further than what human rights wants to accept. I mean, there's no point in outlawing torture if everybody's accepted there should be no torture and it's not happening. There's no point in fighting for gay rights if everybody accepts that they have the same rights. So human rights is always going to be a bit ahead of what society wants to accept. So I don't have a problem with that. The idea of the International Criminal Court being overreached because it's too ambitious, no, I don't think so. It's true that the International Court has not tried a lot of people and is unlikely to try a lot of people. But the idea that everything that was done in Iraq is an international crime, we have written down what sort of international crime it is, and that one day it could still be prosecuted in the International Criminal Court or in one of many about 100 countries around the world. I think that's a big progress. I don't see it as overreach at all. It's ambitious, yes, but not overreaching.
Did they overreach with what they tried to achieve in the 80s, 90s?
Well, at the time, this would have looked like the era of, if you like, sort of liberal hegemony was going to go on and on and on. And so this looked like the era where the West, in some sense, had won. You had a huge imbalance in terms of power with the United States and Europe together. So no, I think if you want to build a liberal world and human rights are central to that, then this looks like this was exactly the moment to do it. What I'm trying to say is that actually what makes that work are the political forces that underlie it, not... certainly at the popular level, I totally agree with Andrew, as I argue in the book, that these human rights movements, small h, small r, are active and working all over the world. That's absolutely right. But the global human rights regime depends on a relatively narrow range of powerful Western liberal states backing it. And the moment you see a country like the United States back off, or you see a president like President Trump say, I wouldn't mind bringing back waterboarding and worse, you lower the international norm, and governments have things they want to do which often break human rights. So without US diplomatic pressure, for me, you're going to see either less pressure on human rights abusing regimes or even a rollback. Because who's going to, in the Philippines, in Vietnam, in Thailand, are the Americans really going to turn up and say, you must clean up your Human Rights Act? No, they're going to say, okay, we want you in our group, our camp, not the Chinese camp. We'll turn a blind eye to your human rights.
A bleak outlook. Question, what can be done? Who has to step up? What could be the consequence?
For me, it's fundamentally about trying to galvanize the part of Western, particularly middle-class publics who are deeply committed to these liberal ideas, and to get them to put pressure on their own governments throughout Europe, in the United States, but also trying to galvanize the Chinese middle class, the Indian middle class, to try to put pressure on their governments with money, with campaigns, to better observe their human rights. So more focus on what's happening in powerful countries and trying to get internal pressure on those governments, and less trying to build global conventions and global institutions. That, for me, is where the focus will need to be for the next decade or so.
Andrew mentioned before that it's not just a question of laws, of ambitions, but it's also questions of policies, let me name it peacemaking or so. Is that a part of your design?
Well, what I suggested earlier was it's possible the human rights movement, such as it's one thing, will have to choose, as it were, whether it's on the left or whether it's in the center, whether it will, you know, when I wrote a book about Amnesty International, it was deeply conflicted about whether it should go on anti-war marches, for example, or peace marches, because these were seen to be political things. I just don't know whether that middle space really exists in the world that we're in. And if you're not campaigning against Marine Le Pen, in some sense, maybe you're complicit in Marine Le Pen's rise. So more human rights might have to be more political, and that might mean peace marches, that might mean marching, as it were, on the left, rather than trying to hold yourself aloof from this.
When you talk about the end times of human rights, you also mentioned that activities in this direction should be on a lower scale. What do you mean by that?
Well, it's not that they should be on a lower scale. As I say, completely agree with Andrew that if you can go to all sorts of places in the world. Many parts of Africa may be excluded, and some parts of Asia, but certainly in Latin America, in many parts of Europe. And you have extremely vibrant, very, very sort of active movements using the language of human rights. So funding that, for me, trying to make those movements effective, giving them resources, trying to give them campaign assistance, is you're focusing on what works and matters on the ground, and often translating this into a local language which works. Some of the campaigns in the hardest areas of all, like anti-FGM campaigns, don't go in there just using human rights language. They rework and customize this language into ideas and concepts that local people will buy into about the treatment of successful, the compassionate treatment of children, things of this sort. So a lot less we're rebuilding a new world with these huge institutions, and a lot more on-the-ground engagement with local human rights movements. And I have a skepticism, as I try to say in the book, that the global human rights movement is capable of doing this, because I think it's heavily invested in the treaties and institutions and defending them that it's already established.
Before I talk to somebody on that line, I
give Andrew the right of reply.
Well, of course he has, and I'll get back to him immediately. But I want to tell you that after our last two questions, we will open the discussion to you. Please think about it now, what question you have, what statement you want to make. But please let me also tell you, we do not want speeches. We've had enough speeches. We have enough points of view at length. Now we want to have short, clear questions, clear statements, but not lengthy speeches, if you will. Thank you very much. Coming back to you, the idea of the efforts for human rights, you mentioned this before, have to be more political too. You agree basically with how Stephen has summed this up?
Yes, no, on this point I think he's absolutely got it right, that it has to be a bottom-up thing. And it's not clear that it can be done out of fancy offices in the West. That is clear. But he mentioned an important word which I'd just like to pick up and maybe expand on a bit. He talked about our complicity in the human rights violations around the world and to reflect on our own contribution. And one of the things which I would just finish with is the complicity in selling the arms to the protagonists, not just in Iraq, but the multiple conflicts around the world. And I think we have to all question the complicity of Western governments in funding, for example, I think I can get into detail, Saudi Arabia in Yemen. It's a very controversial case at the moment. I don't see why it's controversial. It's pretty clear what's going on. But that's all of us that are involved in that, and that's certainly a way of becoming, as Stephen says, a little more political about it and not shying away and saying, oh, but that's to mess with politics. It's not. It's actually to fuel the human rights violations.
The fight for human rights has to become more political, a bit less legal.
Absolutely. No, I've always believed that the human rights struggle is a political struggle. The legal part is tools that some of us sort of try to use to make some progress, but essentially it has to be a political fight.
Questions from the audience? There are microphones here. Is anybody ready to ask it? There's somebody straight ahead. Please, in French or English?
I'll try my English, if you'll accept my accent. Andrew's last comment is extremely interesting because we have a debate between a political scientist and a lawyer. And I give Andrew a softball. Would you talk about not just the difficulties of human rights today, but the relationship between the difficulty of any law, international law or domestic, in how that affects human rights in political terms and legal terms? Because it seems to me that that's fundamental.
Yes, there could be a long answer to that, and I can see some of my students here who are looking worried because they know I can go for 2 hours without a coffee break or anything.
I'll stop you in 20 minutes.
No, I'll do 20 seconds. One of the problems, as Dr. Warner is alluding to, is that international law is created by states, and they create the obligations that they want to have, and they don't necessarily give us the rights and the mechanisms that we need to tackle the human rights situation. However, there are enough creative lawyers around, Louis Joinet being a prime example, who can sort of take the little bits of law that we have and the few mechanisms that we've had within the UN and play with it and develop it and start to get some sort of accountability and some sort of visits to people, as he was describing, and indeed some sorts of prosecutions. Now, I don't think we should leave it to the lawyers. I think other people should get much more involved because lawyers are sort of inherently conservative. I think that's what he's sort of asking me to say. And other people need to say, yeah, but that law is useless. We need a better law, or we need to work around the law. So please bring it on. More political scientists should get involved.
Next question, please. Over here, please. Further at the back there.
Thank you. I'm wondering if this whole human rights discourse isn't really based on a misunderstanding. And the misunderstanding is that we in the West assumed that these rights were universal and that our discourse around the rights was universal. And now maybe the crisis that we're facing is that it turns out that it's our universality and not everybody else's universality. So is there a case to be made that we have to open the agenda and not set the agenda, but allow others to bring in their traditions and their different ways of looking at rights?
Is that part of your overreach argumentation?
Well, I think
in the sense that, excuse me, that Western countries, the Western thinking overreached and thought it was universal?
I think this is a very difficult and complex question, and would be a good question for a 2-hour seminar, definitely. There are undeniably similarities between some human rights claims and some of the claims that we would even take back into empire about spreading modernity and civilization to other parts of the world. And Andrew made this point earlier, that human rights comes up against resistance. Sometimes it can appear as if human rights is a kind of revealed truth that eventually everybody, once they're civilized enough, will come to recognize. Whereas in fact it is a set of moral claims. Fundamentally, it's a moral claim about the status of individuals, about the status of women, about the status of people who aren't heterosexual. And those people who are committed to them are in the end saying, we're committed to changing the way the world works. And that will come up against those people who have fundamentally different beliefs. So they will have beliefs, for example, that children are part of the moral economy of a family and they don't exist as independent legal entities. So you can marry your children off, you can tell your children to go and get a job, they're part of the family economy. So the idea that these children could sue you if you maltreat them is incomprehensible in many parts of the world. As is the idea that your older generations of your family don't have a superior authority over you to the ones that you have. Now, we can challenge that by saying we have a very particular view of the individual, but we aren't, and you know, if we're dealing with ISIS or others, or FGM, then the distinction is very stark. But when you're dealing with very pious, you know, communities of good faith who have deep-seated religious views that aren't necessarily in sympathy with human rights claims, then there's a real struggle here, because people are committed to things which we wouldn't necessarily see as core human rights values or beliefs, but nevertheless come from a place of concern, compassion, care, in that way. And so the question then becomes, how pragmatic can the human rights world be? How much, you know, what kind of deal or negotiation could you do? And in some areas, politically, often you do have to make these deals. You do have to accept that you won't touch some violations because this will just generate too much social resistance. But when you think about women's rights or LGBT rights, really these are at some level non-negotiable. And so there's going to be a clash, there's going to be a challenge, and that's going to look on the other side like the attempt to impose a universal set of beliefs over and against existing cultural and social beliefs. And ultimately, I think if you're a human rights believer, you will have to say, okay, I think the way you treat women is wrong. I think the way you treat your children is wrong. And it's going to make you sound a lot like the missionaries and some of the people who went out with empire. And there's probably no getting away from that.
I understand all of that, and still I ask you the question. The question was, did we overreach? were there issues that probably, in your words, shouldn't have been touched? I'm talking about, for example, sexual rights, things that obviously in the East, in the Islamic world, are extremely touching.
But this implies that what the human rights movement is, if you like, a central consciousness. Human rights are a way of thinking about freedom, and the moment you've released that, then, you know, I did work when I wrote the book about amnesty on its attempt. It initially resisted taking on sexuality rights because it could see how complex this is, and had huge, you know, if we do this in Catholic countries or if we do it in the Islamic countries, then we'll just have no members. But in the end, it was forced to adopt them because the moment you've established this principle that people have a certain kind of physical or moral integrity, then you just can't deny this claim. And LGBT groups or women's groups pushed and pushed until, of course, they had to be adopted because the logic is, from a human rights standpoint, is impossible to resist. So it may look unwise strategically for an organization, but the idea you could stop it happening is nonsensical. Human rights just don't work in that way. People who want their rights will set up and mobilize and organize to try to achieve them.
Same question to you. Was there an element of overreach by thinking what we think is correct, is right, is just, is probably not universally just?
I think Stephen's answered the question very well. I mean, my point would be, even if there are issues at the edge of human rights where the whole world doesn't agree, that shouldn't prevent us from recognizing that questions of the right to life or the right to health were obviously central to the film. And if you asked the Iraqi people, you know, do you believe that you have the right to health and the right to life, they would say yes. They wouldn't say this is something that is imposed and something that we haven't agreed on. Stephen's examples are very good, that there's obviously going to be issues at the edge where people are not ready to accept it. But people didn't accept, you know, women voting until relatively recently, and now it seems normal for us. And it was
even in this country.
You said it, not me. Yes, I'm applying for Swiss citizenship. I have to be careful. But my point is that there is not necessarily an irreversible progress, but there are points at which it does seem to be pushing too far. But I don't think we should allow those issues that are tricky in human rights to prevent us from pushing on with the core and insisting that even ISIS, even in a situation like Iraq, even in Syria, wherever, these are things which we hold dear, not just because it's a moral project, but from my perspective, they're legal entitlements.
That's interesting. Pushing ahead with the core. What is the core?
Well, you'd asked me before the film, you know, what were the human rights violations that we would see in the film? And you know, the right to life is significant there. The right to health, the right to education, the right to housing. You know, I could go on. The right not to be killed as a civilian, the right not to have a hospital destroyed in an armed conflict. We sort of just put all that in doubt because we've got some problems on the edges, or because some people are not respecting it some of the time. I think that would be a tragedy.
One more question down here, please.
Oui, tout à l'heure, lorsque M. Joinet
parlait
dans son français sublime
wonderful French
au public,
j'ai remarqué que I noticed that most of the people didn't have their earphones, so I'm going to try to ask my question in French. The film we just watched, fascinating, was presented in a festival linked with human rights, but it could also have been presented on a TV channel, any channel at any day of the year. And then it wouldn't have been called a film on human rights, it would have been called a report on a war. It's not useless to discuss about this film as a film on human rights. If we ask the question, what does it change if we discuss about this film as a report on war or as a film on human rights? What does it change to our capacity to analyze and to understand what it is about, and your ability also to find a solution to what we have just watched? Did I understand your question well?
You understand English? I'm just wondering what...
only on demand. But
okay.
You're saying... my questions are usually non-understandable, at least that's what people always tell me, especially in this kind of forum. But my question is very simple. If you ask the question, what does it mean to discuss the film as a human rights or just as a war reporting, it changed something. I am not challenging that. It's not the same approach at all, but it might be more concrete, more simple, more down to earth, and in a way more honest as to our importance, powerlessness, to ask this simple question: what does it change to view, to see, to discuss this film as a human rights film and not just as a war reporting?
What does it change to show this as a human rights film and not just as war reporting? I think I'm not part of the organizing team, but I would assume the answer is that the one has a lot to do with the other. I mean, these crimes that we are seeing here and so on, they trigger a lot of questions in terms of how this war is fought, in terms of how people are suffering, but also in terms of the questions. Just a second. Just let us please try to give you an answer.
I think there is, but I think there is something to this question. Because saying it's a human rights film, implicit in that is a demand that we have some responsibility to do something about it. Okay? That's
the one thing. And the second thing, if I may quickly interrupt, Monsieur Motta at the beginning explicitly said that this film is not directly linked to all the questions of human rights that one may ask, but it might trigger. But I interrupted you, I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. But another way to view war reporting is much more along the lines of a kind of pained compassion for suffering. We should observe this and we should see this, but really what we can do about this, I know the Americans are heavily responsible for what happened in Iraq, so it may not be a good example, but in general, we can feel the pathos of suffering, but it doesn't necessarily call forth a demand on us that we are morally responsible to do anything about it. So you get lots of war films which aren't asking you to do anything. They're just saying, isn't this terrible? This happens. This is what human beings do to each other. Whereas saying it's a human rights film is saying we need to mobilize, we need to organize, we're responsible. So I think there is an important distinction between these two things.
Thank you. There's a question way back there.
Well,
oui, attendez le microphone, s'il vous plaît.
Yes, just hold on. You're going to be handed a microphone.
If the young Syrian were in the room, they would say l'égalité doesn't drive automatically to ethically. Ethics.
L'égalité n'est pas égale à l'éthique. L'éthique, c'est tout à fait.
In South Sudan also, well, you always are talking about development. But that means for us to see our children dying of hunger. Thank you.
That was a statement rather than a question. We thank you for that. Are there questions? Down here? Oh, yes, please. And then another one over there. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I thought the point about local human rights movements having to be a lot more political and use a lot more tools and be ready to negotiate. But I feel like the jump from that to the jump to, and therefore the global human rights movement with a capital HR is useless, seems a bit of a jump. So isn't everything that the global human rights movement with a capital HR, isn't everything that they do, isn't that a tool that isn't used all the time, but sometimes it is a little bit used by the local human rights movements? And I was wondering if maybe you could think of any examples where that has happened, where there is an insider-outsider sort of effect.
It's not quite, or it's a question to you.
I've got lots to say, but Andrew hasn't said anything for a while. Are you sure? Okay.
I'll be back with him, don't worry.
So of course this is an excellent question, and if you read, I wrote something recently on Open Global Rights, which is a site I urge you all to look at if you haven't looked at. Lots of advocates from all over the world logging in. And one of the pushbacks from a professor at Harvard, Catherine Sickink, was you don't really get the local being effective without some link into the international, and they feed off each other. And I can see that in some areas, and certainly in terms of the spread of awareness of what human rights are, that's pivotal. But there are many ways in which the global human rights movement is actually counterproductive when it involves itself locally. Partly by what it funds, because it often wants to fund things the people who fund it want to do, and not necessarily what local people will do. So you get campaigns in some places on women's rights or LGBT rights, or when local people want to work on something very, very different, but donors in New York and London and Geneva don't want to fund those things. There's something they want to do. But also, for example, you see in relation to the anti-homosexuality agenda in many African countries, an ambivalence about the degree to which internationals come in and politicize the issue in a particular way, which is problematic. Because once it becomes a huge national issue, then there are votes in it, then people are forced to take a stand, and it exposes often local activists who are working away to expand cultural acceptance and a broader sort of sphere of freedom for themselves. Suddenly it becomes a huge issue, and you get people making speeches, and you get the police under pressure to arrest people. And so, but of course that takes place without negotiation with the local people. That's something which suddenly becomes a priority for Amnesty or Human Rights Watch or one of the other major organizations. So there I think it can be counterproductive. And, you know, if you ask, you know, another area you can see it is in relation to effective mechanisms of justice in Africa. So you get other justice mechanisms in Africa which aren't considered to be really justice at all by the international or transitional justice movement. But in fact, Rwanda being the biggest example, will allow some local people just to move on with their lives because that's really what they want to do. And they don't, and you see some of this in Cambodia as well. We just have to move on, okay? So you keep making us have courts and tribunals. We want to move on.
The same question of the big global and the small local antagonism?
No, I mean, I think Stephen's examples are very good, and actually in preparation for knowing that I was coming to this debate, I did speak to somebody who knows the international and the national and posed the question, you know, should the internationals get closer to the field? And her answer was absolutely not, in the sense that a big organization descending on a country where there's a healthy human rights movement, suddenly the funding for the locals can dry up. The problems that Stephen alludes to happens. They lose access to the media, they lose access to government and so on. So it's a complicated situation, but I'd like to sort of spin it a bit more positively. You were really asking for an example of where the international and the national work well together, and the example that my interlocutor gave me is, of course, what the local groups often want in such a precarious world is protection, and I mean protection with a sort of small p, in the sense that an international human rights group who knows that a human rights activist on the ground is in danger of being arrested or disappeared is capable of contacting a minister in that country or kicking up a fight at the UN, and that offers some sort of protection some of the time to some people. I'm not saying it's perfect, but certainly people in the room here will know of examples that I know of where that sort of watching brief does help locals to operate, and without the international human rights movement, capital H, capital R, if you like, you can't play that role. You can't trigger the Disappearances Convention or go and meet the Secretary General of the United Nations at short notice. So there's definitely a role there, and of course the synergies are more complicated than both of us have had time to explain. Yeah.
Can I just add one thing? Sure. I'll be very quick about this. This, of course, was the classic amnesty model. And I'm not criticizing amnesty here at all. Our world is changed beyond recognition from the 1970s. But through the 90s and 2000s, it was kind of dragged in the social movement direction. In other words, getting more involved locally, trying to create a global movement. And it was sort of pulled away from that very focused intervention on behalf of local activists in that way, because it was a strategic choice about raising profile, raising money, being able to influence at the highest level. So these questions these organizations struggle with too, about, you know, how involved to get locally, should they fund locals but not brand them with international, you know, logos, all of that kind of thing.
Two more questions, please, if there aren't any left. This gentleman again. Is there anybody else? Oh, back here, yeah. I'll come to you. Mm-hmm.
This is a new gentleman on the end there.
Thank you, and this has been a very interesting debate. How much harm has been done to the global human rights project by hypocrisy and double standards in some of the leading proponents of human rights in the West?
What do you mean concrete? A bit more concrete?
I'll be a bit more concrete. Andrew's already given one example, the arms sales to Saudi Arabia for use in Yemen. But we have former President of the United States who's written a biography in which he admits torture took place in Abu Ghraib, and a Senate committee report that hasn't been published, but went extensively into torture committed by the American administration in Iraq. We look at the European governments, at least at a political level, remaining silent when the court system is severely damaged in Hungary and in Poland. We look at Greece, people's access to healthcare, to education, to basic standard of living being ground down as part of austerity measures imposed by the European.
So summing up again, the question?
I'm summing up again. I will sum up. Those are examples. I'm sure we could find many more, but what effect does this double standard, which doesn't go unnoticed, how much harm has that done to the global human rights project?
Disastrous. I think you've put your finger on it. The Abu Ghraib scenario not only led to the idea that it's okay to torture people and mistreat them, but it also created people who were the victims of that, who, some evidence, but it's no surprise to anybody here, became, more radicalized than they might ever have been. Guantanamo, which hasn't been mentioned, has obviously given people ideas that it's okay to torture people and lock them up without giving them a trial, sort of the so-called forever prisoners. So it's very difficult for the United States State Department to go to a government around the world and say, this is how we think you should behave, because if you read any of the State Department memoirs, they will say the first thing that your interlocutor will say, but what about Guantanamo, what about drone strikes, what about Abu Ghraib? You do it, so we thought we could do it. So you've absolutely highlighted it's a complete disaster. Do we give up? No, I think we just have to keep reminding them that to talk like that is to violate human rights. To behave like they did in Abu Ghraib is a war crime. And we have to go after them. I know it's idealistic, but that's me.
Would you like to add anything?
Yeah, this is like the easiest question of all. Of course, it's, as Andrew says, completely catastrophic. I mean, the list we could get. I mean, one of the most shocking things to me recently, I don't know whether you saw it, was Samantha Power cozying up to Henry Kissinger. I mean, if you are a human rights person, then Henry Kissinger's the Antichrist. He's openly destroyed Cambodia, without, in the cause of furthering a war that had nothing to do with the Cambodians. Sorry? Yeah. So, Yemen, the arms sales, there are so many other examples. The British government is President Kenyatta in Kenya cites the British government as an example of a government that sees human rights as problematic and wants to pull out of them. Also, one of the things we're going to see more and more of, and Marine Le Pen is excellent at this, is what Cliff Bob, a fellow academic of mine, calls weaponizing human rights. She uses defense of human rights as a way to attack Islam and be Islamophobic by saying, look what they would do to gay people, radical Muslims. So in order to defend human rights, we must basically go to war on Islam and exclude Muslims from our societies. So, yes, this is a complete open door. The extraordinary hypocrisy, particularly of American and, to a lesser degree, British foreign policy for decades, if not longer, is completely exposed. And I have to make this point. You'll all have seen the interview that Donald Trump said when he was asked, but isn't Vladimir Putin a killer? And he's turned into Noam Chomsky and said, what, you think our government doesn't kill people? I mean, so he's just giving the game away completely. There is, of course, a side of the United States. It's the ACLU side. It's the people demanding that the torture lawyers and others are held to account, that Guantanamo is closed. Of course, there's that side of America. But the formal state side of America has been killing people and, doing all, destroying societies for decades in the service of American foreign policy goals.
Question here.
Oui, bonsoir.
Good evening. So here's my question. So today, So yes, with the excuse of fighting terrorism, the state of emergency that's been implemented in France as started in the U.S. under the Patriot Act, and we have a lot of whistleblowers who are actually calling our attention upon our own individual liberties. So like in Eritrea or in other countries like Russia, entity like Erdogan, who are using the state of emergency to actually.
On ne montre pas spécialement la voix aussi, donc je voulais savoir comment voyez-vous l'évolution.
Silence anyone against them.
We have state of emergency in more and more states, all the way to France. We have the situation in the United States that you have already mentioned. We have dictatorships all over the place. We have the situations from Eritrea all the way to Putin, if you will. How do you see things evolve? That was the question.
Yeah, it's not good. And the book I wrote was really about that democratic erosion in Turkey, in Hungary, and in other parts of the world. And I just hinted that there was resistance to this within Western societies. But of course, that's all changed very, very rapidly. These are governments with state interests. They don't like opposition necessarily. The key concept that we're going to have to get used to in the next 10 years is what we might call democratic erosion. Okay? The military are not going to take over the United States. Okay? But what is going to happen is that the quality of its democracy is going to erode. If you're a black American, African American, you're already seeing that in the way that the Voting Rights Act is being gutted to prevent you from voting. You're seeing it in Donald Trump trying to undermine the freedom of the press and the idea that the press is a neutral entity. You know, demonizing lawyers and demonizing courts. These are classic authoritarian moves. So you're not going to get a coup, but you are going to discover it's harder and harder to dissent, harder and harder to get the government to be accountable. And I think that's something, you know, if you are an activist focused on core civil and political rights, it's trying to prevent further erosion of those democratic standards within Western societies. That, for me, is the antidote to overreach, is really go back to basics and start holding these governments to account. Because if they give up on the human rights project, then there just won't be a global human rights project.
Final question to both of you. The world is changing very rapidly. It becomes less and less predictable. The outlook for human rights is bleak. Would you subscribe to that theory?
Well, right. So at the end here, I think ultimately human rights are just a basic demand for to be treated with fairness and to be treated in a broad sense justly. Okay, and people are furious, however calm you are. There are situations in which you are treated unfairly and it just drives you crazy. And for me, that lies at the root of these human rights demands. It's not fair that I would be treated in this way, or my family, or my community. And I don't think that can go away. So I think that will always be the case, that you will get people who will organize and mobilize to try to resist bad things that are happening to them. But they're going to use a lot of other mechanisms, the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States, or the way in which Pope Francis has even become something of an entrepreneur in some of these areas. I think we're going to see a lot more of different ways to try to do this: consumer boycotts, the use by anonymous of cyber attacks on governments, WikiLeaks, all these other areas which aren't necessarily part of a broader human rights movement, but are designed to hold governments and those with power to account. So no, the outlook for human rights in that sense of people resisting arbitrary power, I think that can't go away unless we do end up in 1984 with George Orwell. But the global human rights movement, I just think this isn't where the game is going to be for a decade or more. It's going to be fighting to preserve democratic standards within developed societies. That's where I think the real struggle is going to be now.
Outlook may be bleak, but new powers, new venues will emerge. Is that what we can see from here?
I think I'm going to try and echo what Louis Joinet was urging us to do, that precisely for the reasons that the last questioner raised, the governments in the face of threats of terrorism are expanding their powers, they are engaging in states of emergency, they are engaging in surveillance, they are engaging in new threats to the right to life with drone attacks and all the rest of it. And citizens are being told that this is acceptable and necessary. But I think the human rights experience is that once governments can take some of those powers, they tend to keep hold of them even after the threat has gone. And I think what Louis Joinet was asking us to do was to rester vigilant. We have to keep challenging them in the ways that Stephen has been describing, and we all have to become human rights, I'm not quite sure what the word is, but le vigilantes, which will keep and hold governments to account.
Which was a better final word than I could have found. Thank you very much for that. Thank you to both of you very much. And thank you to all of you for coming. Thank you for your interest, and have a good evening.